I hope you are doing really good and make progress in the course. In the two last sessions, I focused on bureaucracy. I portrayed organizations as a rational system or rational systems made up by goals and rules. The task for organizational members, the bureaucrats, is to follow already written rules, giving organizations a high degree of reliability. In this session, I will focus on a perspective that proposes that what organizational theorists should focus on is to understand how rules inside organizations are decided. These scholars shift focus from the rules itself to the process of actually forming the rules through decisions. I will focus on three types of decision-making processes in organizations. I will start with a theory that I think is closest to bureaucracy theory called rule-based decision-making. Then I will focus on a theory about decision-making borrowed from economics, usually called the rational decision-making model, before I talk about an adapted version of this rational model called bounded rational model, or the bounded rationality. Bounded rationality is perhaps the theory that have been most influential in organizational theory, with really close ties to a major research program called the behavioral or a behavioral theory of the firm. But before I focus on the three theories of decision making, I will start talking about what a decision is, because we need a definition. As you can read in the course book, scholars began to be interested in decision making as organizations grew larger and more popular. When organizations grow, they often decentralize, meaning that they create new departments or offices to coordinate behavior inside the organization. Typically, this means that more managers are hired and have to be aligned to the goals of the organization. Organizations sometimes have to formulate multiple goals at different levels of the organization. Strategies have to be invented for how to achieve these goals, and formal procedures have to develop to follow up work in general and in between departments. It has become the task of the manager, the typical decision maker, to carry out this work. Decision making is directly linked to Weber's bureaucracy through the concept of a rule. One simple definition of a decision is that it's an explicit agreement between people to do something. People are choosing one alternative in front of another alternative. And when people are making the choice between one alternative and the other alternative, they're also making a rule, a commitment to follow the decision. People can decide to create a rule, people can take a decision to change a rule, and people can take a decision to not follow any rules. But that means that they are actually creating a new rule. This means that work inside the bureaucracy should be full of decision making. The elected higher officials create new rules, but the bureaucrats inside the bureaucracy also takes decisions when they are working to serve the clients. It's important to emphasize that decision making means that we are choosing one alternative in front of another. If there would be no alternatives, then we don't take a decision. The existence of alternatives is basically a prerequisite to be able to take a decision. And I will come back to this later in the course when we talk about institutions. Decisions and institutions can be seen as two different types of social order. And by social order, I basically mean how we create order in a society. Decision making is a social order that involves choosing one alternative in front of another. There is always a choice between two or more alternatives. If we have two pair of jeans, we can choose to wear the blue pair and not the gray pair. An institution is a social order that is highly taken for granted. People just do what they always do. If something is institutionalized, there are no clear alternatives to what people already do. Before COVID-19, it was commonly accepted to shake hands before a formal meeting. If we didn't do that, people looked strange at us, and we had to give an explanation for why we didn't want to shake their hands. It was considered to be really rude. So a decision and an institution is directly related to each other. In a way, they are each other's opposites. As you see, decision making is a topic that is broader than organization theory. People take decisions even outside organizations. This has also meant that much of the research on decision making have been produced in psychology, basically outside the context of an organization. In this course, we will think about decision making as a process that happens inside the context of an organization. So, going back to organization theory, in the 50s and 60s, just before decision making was introduced to organization theory as a field, the field was basically bifurcated into, roughly speaking, 3 branches. The first branch was represented by Max Weber's theory of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy offered some kind of toolbox to understand formal structure, the rules and the goals of organizations, but it didn't really say much about how these rules were produced in the first place and how they changed in relation to the organization's environment. The second branch was a social psychological branch, trying to understand how to improve people's working conditions in organizations. They had a clear emphasis on efficiency, so they tried to improve working conditions basically and make employees more efficient. You can, for instance, read about this approach in one of the chapters in the course book, especially about the Hawthorne experiments. The third branch was about administrative behavior, focusing on problems perceived and understood by executives, by managers. This approach really focused on how to lead, how to manage, and how to make the best of organizational members. You can also read more about this approach in the course book, and you will read a little bit more about this when you're reading about leadership. But it wasn't part of organization theory, and it hasn't been part of organization theory, really, since the beginning, basically. The first approach to decision making, the rule-based theory, is perhaps closest to the theory of bureaucracy. Here, as the name suggests, rules plays a really important role in guiding decision makers' attention. Decision makers, when confronted with a problem, they start to search for the appropriate rules to follow. They ask themselves, what rule is appropriate for me to follow in a situation like this? It means that when conditions change, decision makers search for new rules to follow, and they use the most appropriate rules for their decisions. Think about the bureaucrats in Weber's bureaucracy. When they are confronted with a client that have to understand the client's situation, and when they are searching for the appropriate rules for how to handle this client, and when they find a rule, the bureaucrat take a decision. The rule-based theory of decision-making suggests that organizations are like a social system that modifies the rules for action incrementally on the basis of feedback from the environment. Think back to the figure I presented in the previous session, session number 6. When the environment changed, the organization internalized these changes by changing rules. These rules are then used for decision-making processes in the context of the daily life of the organization. So the first theory emphasized Decision making as a process where decision making search for appropriate rules to base their decision on. Decision makers analyze their situation and compare their situation to the rules which they have at hand. Decision making process is heavily influenced by matching a situation with a set of rules. Decision making are not about the pursuit of self-interest or the calculation of future consequences of current choices. It's about matching a changing set of situations to a set of rules, basically. The second and the third theory of this decision making emphasizes decision process as rational and to some extent calculated, consequential decision processes. Decision makers analyze their situation, they try to predict the future, and they try to take informed decisions based on their prediction. In the second theory, the rational choice model, they do it fully rationally. They have information about all possible alternatives and they can calculate all the consequences of these alternatives. In the third theory, or in the third model, the bounded rationality model, they take decisions by trying to satisfy. They use the information they have about possible alternatives and they choose the alternatives that fulfills their goals and their desires. Let's focus on the rational choice model first. So rational choice have been used extensively in modern economics and large part of the rest of social science. In the model, human action is seen as the result of human choice and intentionality. Decision makers collect information and take informed decisions that maximizes their utility. First, the model presumes that decision makers have all possible knowledge of all alternatives for actions and all of the consequences following the alternatives. Decision makers are like supercomputers or fortune tellers. Second, decision makers know what they want and they can choose the alternative that is considered to be the best alternative. Decision makers can rank different alternatives and make rational decisions. Sometimes the model is expanded by adding a risk preference, basically stating that decision makers try to avoid uncertainty and high risks. Rational choice is simple to use, and which I said in the previous sessions, simplicity can be a really good thing when working with theories. To theorize is to simplify. But perhaps the worst enemy of rational choice is exactly its simplicity and unrealistic assumptions about people and decision makers. Especially for anyone with an ambition to focus closer on decision-making processes in organizations. Many researchers just thought that the rational choice model didn't match the reality. Decision makers in organizations didn't seem to be so smart, so intelligent, and so rational as the model assumed. In fact, they often found quite the opposite. That decision makers rarely knew all the alternatives and they seldom knew the consequences of their alternatives. Decision makers might not even know what they prefer. They simply can't rank different alternatives. Decision makers are not supercomputers. They are not fortune tellers. So bounded rationality came to be presented as a solution to the limitations of the rational choice model. In the bounded rationality model, decision makers don't have knowledge about all alternatives and all the consequences of these alternatives. Instead, when a decision maker is going to take a decision, for instance when they are confronted with a problem, they first have to search for alternatives and the consequences of these alternatives. However, adding search to the decision making process do make the model much more complicated and raises many more questions, such as when do decision makers start searching for alternatives? When do they stop? How do they search? What types of alternatives do they search for? The solution came to be the introduction of two additional concepts to the rational choice model. Boundedly rational decision makers have goals and they have aspirations. Aspirations is more or less the same as ambitions. Okay, so goals and aspirations came to be really important concepts regulating search processes. If decision makers fail to fulfill or reach their aspiration levels on their goals, they experience that they have a problem. The problem in turn stimulates search processes. So decision makers start search for alternatives when they are failing to achieve their aspirations on the goals. And this is very commonsensical. If we have an aspiration to be a good mathematician and we fail a math test, we are more likely to think that we have a problem. We need to search for a solution for alternatives. This means that decision makers are problem oriented, and the problem is defined as the discrepancy, the difference between aspirations and their actual performance. When decision makers realize they have a problem, they start to search for alternatives. They stop searching for alternatives when they find an alternative that promises to restore performance above their aspiration levels. If we apply the boundedly rational model of decision making to organizations, we get a model where decision makers in organizations formulate organizational goals. They define organizational aspiration levels. Decision makers collect performance feedback on their goals, and if performance is above their aspiration levels, they continue working as usual. If performance is below their aspiration levels, they start searching for alternatives, for solutions. When researchers investigate this empirically, researchers have often focused on some type of financial measure, such as return on investment. The model is much more general than that and can potentially be applied to all types of goals. A typical change that has been studied by researchers is how organizations change rules for what type of product or activities they produce, so-called strategically important decisions. An important part of the model is that aspiration levels are adaptive to previous performance. If decision makers find that their organization have been performing below aspiration levels for an extended period of time, they tend to lower their aspiration levels. Decision makers comes to expect less of the future. Again, this is quite intuitive. Just take the example from our everyday life. If I have been performing badly below my aspiration levels, let's say I'm running 10 kilometers, I also tend to decrease my aspirations. Perhaps I just had set my goals to too high. Instead of aspiring to run 10 kilometers on 45 minutes, I should perhaps aspire to run it on 50 minutes. This, of course, is a good strategy if I want to ease my mood and find less problems. So when decision makers in organizations lower their aspiration levels, they also tend to find less problems, right? And as a result, they tend to become less likely to start search processes. And of course, the opposite applies. If decision makers find that their organization have been performing above aspiration levels for an extended period of time, they tend to raise their aspirations. They come to expect more of the future. But since it's more difficult to maintain high performance, they're also more likely to find problems. So the model tends to keep performance levels and aspiration levels fairly close together by adapting aspirations performance. Decision makers learn what they should expect. And by adapting performance to aspirations, by increasing search in the face of failure, and by decreasing search when faced with success. So the model of boundedly rational decision makers introduces 4 really important and central concepts to the rational choice model. It's satisfying, it's search, it's goals, and adaptive aspiration levels. Even if it makes the model more complicated compared to the rational choice model, it was justified by a better match with empirical observations on actual decision-making processes in organizations. In the sessions about bureaucracy, we learned that the existence of rules makes it possible for modern societies to function. Organizations can learn to produce the same product or the same service over and over again. Organizational members follow rules, which leads to a high degree of reliability. Theories of decision-making and decision-making processes in organizations portray organizations as constantly changing and includes decision-makers who both adapt and follow rules. In regard to the two opposites, stability and change, bureaucracy theory and behavior theory are positioned on the opposite ends. Bureaucracy theory emphasizes stability and decision-making emphasizes change. This tension between organizational stability and change is important and an interesting discussion point, and something which you can elaborate on in your course paper. Before you move on to the next session, don't forget to update and incorporate decision making in the general analytical framework which I presented earlier in the course. Try to illustrate the three different decision-making processes and try to integrate them with the theory of bureaucracy. And be creative, but remember to keep it simple.